The heavy gold wedding band slipped from Mara's trembling fingers, clattering against the cold marble floor with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the silent hallway. Through the narrow crack in the mahogany study door, she watched her world being dismantled in ink and paper. Lee Tae sat across from an investor whose eyes were as sharp as the ice in his glass. Between them lay a legal contract and a surveillance photo of Mara. "The terms are non-negotiable, Mr. Lee," the investor said, his voice dripping with corporate coldness. "We provide the capital to save your family's legacy. In exchange, you divorce the woman in that photo. She is an unsuitable variable for our merger. My daughter will take her place." Mara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited for the man she had spent years building up, the man she loved, to roar in defiance, to tear the paper to shreds. But Lee Tae's pen didn't even tremble. He didn't ask for a moment to think. He signed the divorce papers with a flourish. One signature. That was the price of 3 years of marriage. Mara stumbled back, her soul shattering into as many pieces as her reputation. She had to run. She had to get out before the tears burning her eyes spilled over, before they saw her humiliated. But as she spun to flee, she collided with a solid, broad chest. Large, warm hands gripped her shoulders, steadying her. Mara looked up, gasping. Before her stood a man who radiated a terrifying, magnetic power. He had slicked-back silver-gray hair and an intense gaze that seemed to read every secret written in her soul. A dark tattoo peeked out from the collar of his burgundy velvet tuxedo. "Leaving so soon, Mara?" His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. This was Kim Joon, Lee Tae's estranged, legendary uncle. He glanced at the door she'd been spying through, then back at her tear-streaked face. A slow, predatory smile touched his lips. "It appears we both have reasons to make the Lee family regret their arrogance. I have a proposition for you." Mara's breath hitched as Kim Joon's hands remained on her shoulders, his touch steadying yet strangely electric. Behind the heavy mahogany doors, she could still hear the muffled, celebratory clinking of crystal, the sound of Lee Tae toasting to his new, suitable life while hers lay in ruins on the floor. "Deep breaths, Mara," Joon murmured. His voice was like velvet over gravel, calm and dangerously composed. "Don't let them hear you crumble. That is exactly what they expect." He guided her away from the door and toward the expansive stone terrace that led into the estate's private gardens. The night air was cool, smelling of damp earth and expensive jasmine, a sharp contrast to the suffocating scent of cologne and betrayal inside. Mara finally found her voice, though it was raw. "How do you even know my name? I've never seen you at a single family dinner. T never mentioned an uncle." Joon led her to a secluded stone bench beneath a weeping willow, the silver moonlight catching the sharp lines of his face and the intricate ink trailing up his neck. "T doesn't mention things that frighten him," Joon replied, leaning against a nearby pillar. "And my family, they prefer to pretend I don't exist until they need a problem to disappear. But I have been watching you, Mara. I've watched you build that boy's reputation while his parents treated you like a temporary guest in your own home." Mara looked down at her bare ring finger, the skin still pale where her wedding band had lived for 3 years. "It's over. He signed it away for a check. I have nothing left." "On the contrary," Joon said, stepping into her line of sight. He reached into his burgundy velvet jacket and pulled out a sleek black handkerchief, offering it to her. "You have the one thing the Lee family fears most, the truth, and now you have a choice. You can walk out of those gates and let them tell the world you weren't enough, or you can take a seat at a different table." Mara wiped her eyes, her gaze sharpening. What table could possibly be higher than the one they just kicked me off of? Joon leaned down, his face inches from hers. The dangerous charisma she had sensed earlier was now a physical weight. "Mine. Marry me, Mara. Not for love, not yet, but for the power to make them bow. My family thinks they are kings of industry, but they forget who owns the ground they stand on. Marry me, and I will give you a throne that makes their little corporate empire look like a playground." Mara stared into his intense, silver-gray eyes. She saw no pity there, only a cold, calculating promise of war. For the first time that night, the crushing weight of heartbreak was replaced by a spark of something lethal. "They want a suitable wife for the Lee legacy," Mara whispered, a dark smile finally touching her lips. I think it's time they met the matriarch. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Mara's apartment, but its warmth felt miles away. On the mahogany coffee table sat the black silk handkerchief Joon had given her, a silent reminder of the garden and the impossible choice he had laid at her feet. Mara sat with her laptop glowing in the dim light, her fingers hovering over the keys. She had started with the basics: Kim Joon, Lee dynasty. The public records were scrubbed clean: mentions of an estranged brother, a handful of high-end real estate holdings, and a reputation for private venture capital. But Mara knew how to look deeper. She began searching international archives and encrypted forums, peeling back the layers of the man with the silver hair and the lethal gaze. The deeper she dug, the more the air seemed to leave the room. Kim Joon wasn't just a businessman, he was a shadow king. There were whispers of a man known as the architect of the underworld, a strategist who controlled the ports, the logistics, and the silent flow of power across the Pacific. He didn't just break bones, he broke empires. The neck tattoos she had seen weren't just art, they were symbols of a hierarchy that answered only to him. In one blurred, grainy photo from a gala in Seoul, a dozen men in dark suits stood behind him, their heads bowed in a level of deference that no board of directors could ever command. He was the man the city's elite whispered about when they thought no one was listening. He was the reason the Lee family thrived, and yet he was the person they were most terrified to acknowledge. Mara closed the laptop, her heart racing against her ribs. To marry him wasn't just a business deal, it was a descent into a world where the rules were written in blood, not ink. She thought of Lee Tae's easy betrayal, the way his pen hadn't even hesitated to sign her away for a corporate check. He had treated her like a liability to be liquidated. She stood up, walking to the mirror. She smoothed her hair and looked at the woman staring back, a woman who had been too soft, too loyal, and too easily discarded. If she wanted to destroy the people who had humiliated her, she couldn't do it as a victim. She needed a weapon. Picking up her phone, she dialed the number Joon had left on a heavy, linen card. It picked up on the first ring. "I've done my research," Mara said, her voice steadying as she leaned into the danger. "I know exactly who you are, Joon." There was a brief, weighted silence on the other end, followed by that low, gravelly chuckle. "And, are you running, Mara, or are you ready to rule?" "Pick me up," she replied, her eyes flashing with a newfound coldness. "I'm ready to sign the contract." The heavy glass doors of the luxury cafe swung open, and Lee Tae was already checking his watch when Mara stepped inside. He looked exactly as he had the night of the betrayal, crisp, corporate, and utterly hollow. When he saw her, his expression shifted into a mask of practiced pity, the kind one offers a tragic accident victim. "Mara, thank you for coming," he said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the marble table before she could even sit. "I wanted to do this quickly. My schedule is tight with the merger preparations." Mara didn't touch the envelope. She simply arched a perfectly groomed brow, her deep brown skin glowing against the white silk of her blouse. "Is that so? I assume this isn't a belated anniversary gift." T sighed, leaning forward. "It's a settlement. $2 million, the title to the condo in the city, and a non-disclosure agreement. My parents feel it's generous, considering, well, the circumstances. We just need you to disappear quietly. No social media posts, no interviews about the family. We need a clean slate for my marriage to Melissa." Mara looked at the envelope as if it were a piece of rotting fruit. $2 million. Is that the value you've placed on 3 years of my life, T? Or is that just the change left over from the $50 million you sold your soul for? "Be realistic, Mara," T snapped, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You were never going to fit into our world long-term. This money ensures you're taken care of. Take it and find someone more in your lane, someone who doesn't have a dynasty to protect." Mara let out a soft, melodic laugh that caused heads to turn. She reached into her designer clutch, but she didn't pull out a pen. Instead, she produced a simple, elegant document embossed with a seal that made T's blood go cold. "You're a little late with the payout, T. I don't need your condo, and I certainly don't need your permission to stay in this city." She leaned in, her eyes flashing with a predatory light he had never seen before. "I've already moved on. In fact, I'm already married." T's jaw dropped. "Married? It's been 48 hours. Who would even have you on such short notice?" "Someone who doesn't hide behind his parents," she whispered. "Someone who values a queen over a contract. I've married your Uncle June." The color drained from T's face so fast he looked like a ghost. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The name Kim Joon carried a weight that could crush the Lee family legacy in a single afternoon. "Check the registry, T," Mara said, rising to her full, statuesque height. "And tell your parents to keep their 2 million. From now on, when you see me, you'll address me as your aunt. And if I were you, I'd start practicing your bow." She turned and walked out, leaving the envelope, and Lee Tae's dignity, lying untouched on the table. The penthouse was silent, illuminated only by the amber glow of the city skyline bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling glass. There were no flower girl petals, no judgmental in-laws, and no prying cameras. Just a sleek, black-clad efficient and the weight of a vow that felt more like a blood oath than a marriage contract. Mara stood before Kim Joon, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was breathtaking in her white satin gown, the deep V-neck and high slit radiating a sensual elegance that seemed to pull the very air from the room. Beside her, Joon was a vision of dark authority in his burgundy velvet tuxedo. The silver gray of his hair shimmered under the chandelier, and for the first time, Mara noticed the way his gaze lingered, not on the papers they had just signed, but on the pulse fluttering in her throat. "You may seal the union," the officiant murmured, before vanishing into the shadows of the foyer. Mara turned to Joon, expecting a cold, formal nod to finalize their business arrangement. Instead, she found him already closing the distance. His hand, warm and calloused, slid up her neck, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw with a possessiveness that made her breath hitch. The dangerous charisma she had admired from afar was now a physical heat, intoxicating and overwhelming. "This was supposed to be a strategic alliance, Mara," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shiver down her spine. "But standing here, looking at you, I find I'm not interested in being a silent partner." His eyes dropped to her lips, intense and hungry. When he finally leaned in, the kiss wasn't the polite press of a business associate. It was deep, demanding, and tasted of expensive scotch and forbidden promises. Mara's fingers instinctively tangled in the soft velvet of his lapel, pulling him closer as the lines between revenge and desire blurred into nothingness. The heat between them was a physical force, a spark that threatened to incinerate the memory of Lee Tae's cold betrayal. In June's arms, Mara didn't feel like a discarded wife or a corporate variable. She felt like a prize. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers, his breath ragged. "The Lee family thinks they've thrown you away," he murmured against her skin, his grip tightening on her waist. "They have no idea that they just handed me the only thing I've ever truly wanted to own." Mara looked up into his silver-gray eyes, seeing the flicker of the mafia boss beneath the tuxedo, the man who broke rules and claimed territories. For the first time, she realized that while she had married him for protection, the greatest danger in the room might actually be the man holding her. And to her surprise, she didn't want to run. The transition from her modest apartment to Kim Joon's penthouse was like stepping into a gilded cage where the bars were made of reinforced steel and smoked glass. The fortress, as the staff called it, sat atop the highest spire in the city, a sprawling expanse of black marble, brushed gold and silence. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, expectant hush of a command center. Mara adjusted to the luxury first. Her wardrobe was replaced overnight with silk slips, tailored power suits, and diamonds that felt heavy with the weight of June's protection. Every time she moved through the halls, the air seemed to shift. Men in razor-sharp suits, with earpieces and eyes that never blinked, would stop dead in their tracks as she passed. They didn't just move out of her way. They bowed, deep, respectful inclinations of the head that signaled she was no longer just a woman, but a sovereign entity. However, the luxury came with shadows. One evening, Mara found herself wandering toward the north wing, the rhythmic click of her stilettos echoing against the marble. She reached the door of June's private study just as it swung open. 3 men walked out, their faces grim, their knuckles bruised. They froze when they saw her, their eyes instantly dropping to the floor. "Aunt Mara," they murmured in unison, the title feeling like both a shield and a burden. Through the doorway, she saw June. He was sitting behind a massive obsidian desk, his burgundy sleeves rolled up to reveal the full extent of the tattoos winding down his muscular forearms. He was looking at a map, his expression cold and calculating, a version of him that existed entirely outside their bedroom. On the desk sat a heavy, serrated blade and a stack of ledgers that had nothing to do with corporate mergers. June looked up, and the ice in his eyes thawed instantly into something dark and beckoning. "You're wandering, Mara. The North Wing is dull. There are better things for you to see." He rose and walked toward her, his presence filling the hallway. He didn't hide the bloodstain on the cuff of his shirt, nor did he apologize for the men who had just left. He simply took her hand, his thumb tracing the new, massive diamond on her finger. "The Lee family played at power," he whispered, leading her back toward the living area. "But here, power isn't played. It's enforced. You wanted to be a queen, Mara. This is what it looks like when the crown is real." Mara looked back at the closed study door, then at the man holding her hand. The reality was sinking in. She hadn't just married into wealth. She had married into a war. And as she looked at her reflection in the glass, draped in June's diamonds and surrounded by his soldiers, she realized she wasn't afraid. She was waking up. The rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the lobby as Mara stepped out of the private elevator, her presence commanding the attention of every security detail in the room. She was draped in a floor-length charcoal trench coat, her long, wavy hair cascading over her shoulders, but her path was suddenly blocked. Lee Tae stood by the fountain, looking like a ghost of the man she had once loved. His designer suit was rumpled, his tie was askew, and the arrogance that usually defined his posture had been replaced by a jagged, desperate edge. He looked small in the shadow of the towering skyscraper, small and broken. "Mara," he breathed, stepping forward. The doormen moved instantly to intercept him, their hands ghosting over the weapons concealed beneath their jackets, but Mara raised a single, gloved hand to stay with them. "How did you get past the gates, T?" she asked, her voice as cool as the marble floors. "I told them I was family. I told them I needed to save you," he stammered, reaching out as if to touch her arm, though he thought better of it when he saw the icy lack of recognition in her eyes. "The merger, it's a disaster, Mara. Victoria Chin pulled the funding. My father is losing everything. Melissa is a nightmare. I made a mistake, a horrible $50 million mistake. I was blinded by the legacy, but it's you I need. We can fix this. You don't have to stay with him." Mara looked at him, and for the first time, she felt nothing. No anger, no heat, just a profound sense of distance. "You didn't come here because you love me, T. You came here because the world you traded me for is burning down, and you think I'm still the girl who will provide the fire extinguisher." "I love you," he cried, his voice echoing pathetically in the high-ceilinged lobby. "You're living with a monster. Do you know what they say about Kim Joon? Do you know what he does to people who cross him?" "I know exactly what he does." A voice rumbled from the shadows of the mezzanine. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Kim Joon descended the stairs. He hadn't bothered with a jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark ink on his throat, and his silver-gray hair was slicked back with lethal precision. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked until he stood behind Mara, placing a heavy, possessive hand on her waist. T recoiled, his eyes wide with a primal sort of terror. He looked at his uncle, then at the way Mara leaned back into June's touch, not out of fear, but out of belonging. "My wife is no longer a part of your we, Lee Tae," June said, his gaze fixed on his nephew with the terrifying stillness of a predator. "You put a price on her head, and I paid it. She belongs to a different dynasty now, one you aren't invited to join." June leaned down, pressing a lingering kiss to Mara's temple while staring T down. "If I see you near my gates again, I won't send you back to your father. I'll send you to the silent places where my enemies go." T stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet before spinning and fleeing into the rainy night. Mara watched him go, then turned in Joon's arms. The monster looked down at her, his thumb stroking her cheek with a tenderness that was for her eyes only. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she whispered, a dark, satisfied glow in her eyes. "I just realized I don't need a fire extinguisher. I like the heat." The rain continued to drum against the glass, but inside the penthouse, the air had grown thick with a different kind of intensity. After Lee Tae's desperate intrusion, the silence between Mara and Joon felt heavy, charged with things left unsaid. Joon hadn't let go of her waist. His touch remained a steady, grounding heat through the silk of her dress. He led her toward the oversized velvet sofa, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He didn't offer her a drink. He simply sat beside her, the lethal Mafia CEO replaced by a man who looked suddenly, uncharacteristically weary. "You handled him well," Joon said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its sharp, public edge. "Most people tremble when they see the Lee family name. You made him look like a ghost." Mara turned to him, her gaze tracing the jagged lines of the tattoos that disappeared beneath his collar. "I stopped fearing ghosts the moment I realized I was being protected by a king." She reached out, her fingers ghosting over the pulse point at his wrist. "But I know the cost of that protection, Joon. I see the blood on the cuffs. I see the calls you take at 4 in the morning." Joon stilled, his silver-gray eyes searching hers. For weeks, they had danced around the reality of their arrangement. A contract forged in spite, a business deal meant to humble their enemies. But the friction of their lives had worn away the professional boundaries. The fake smiles for the cameras had become genuine. The tactical touches had turned into a desperate need for contact. "I didn't intend for this to be real," Joon confessed, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her lip with agonizing slowness. "I wanted to use you to punish my family. I thought I could remain detached. But every time you walk into a room, every time you stare down a man twice your size without flinching, I realize I'm no longer playing a game. I'm protecting what is mine." Mara leaned into his palm, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective heat. "It stopped being a game for me the night you gave me a handkerchief in the garden. You didn't just give me a throne, Joon. You gave me a voice." The space between them vanished. This time, when they kissed, there was no audience to impress and no revenge to plot. It was a slow, desperate collision of 2 souls who had been discarded by the world only to find a home in each other's shadows. The alliance had burned away, leaving behind a love that was as dark and unbreakable as the empire they were building together. As Joon pulled her closer, his lips hovering against hers, he whispered a promise that wasn't in any contract. "I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone hurt you again." Mara smiled against his skin, finally realizing that the greatest power she held wasn't the Mafia's wealth. It was the heart of the man who controlled it. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a sea of glittering silk and hushed conversations, the air heavy with the scent of expensive lilies and the desperation of the Lee family. Tonight was supposed to be Lee Tae's triumphant return, the night he and Melissa Chin would solidify their status as the city's new power couple. But as the double mahogany doors swung open, the music faltered, and a sudden, sharp silence swept through the room like a cold front. Mara stood at the top of the grand staircase, radiating a confident, sensual elegance that made every other woman in the room feel invisible. Her white satin gown caught the light of 1,000 crystals, the plunging neckline and thigh-high slit revealing just enough of her deep brown skin to be dangerous. She looked like a goddess carved from starlight and defiance. Beside her, Kim Joon was the embodiment of lethal charisma. In his burgundy velvet tuxedo, his silver-gray hair perfectly slicked back, he looked less like an estranged uncle and more like a king returning to reclaim a stolen throne. He didn't look at the crowd. His gaze was fixed solely on Mara, his hand resting possessively in the small of her back. As they descended the stairs, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Lee Tae stood at the center of the room, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as his glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor, a mirror of the betrayal that had started it all. "Uncle," Tae stammered, his voice cracking. What is the meaning of this? This is a private event for the board. Joon stepped forward, his intense gaze pinning his nephew to the spot. I know exactly what tonight is, T. It's the night the Lee family accounts are balanced. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single, embossed document. While you were busy trading your wife for an investment that never came, I was busy buying. I didn't just marry Mara. I bought the Lee family's outstanding debt. Every mortgage, every line of credit, every cent you owe to the Chin family now belongs to the Kim syndicate. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Mara stepped up beside Joon, her long, dangling earrings catching the light as she tilted her head. She looked at T, then at his horrified parents, with a smile that was beautiful and devastating. You told me I wasn't suitable for your world, T, Mara said, her voice melodic and clear enough for everyone to hear. You were right. I'm far too overqualified. I'm not here to be a part of your family. I'm here as your landlord. She turned to Joon, who looked at her with a pride that bordered on worship. Shall we dance, my love? I believe we own the floor. Leaving the Lee family standing in the wreckage of their own legacy, Mara and Joon glided into the center of the room, the new masters of a world that had once tried to erase her. The silence that followed Mara's declaration was heavier than any debt, a suffocating vacuum that left the Lee family gasping for air in their own ballroom. Lee Tae stood paralyzed, his eyes darting from the legal document in Joon's hand to the woman he had once called his wife. He looked for a flicker of the soft, compliant Mara he had known, the woman who would have comforted him in a crisis. He found only a queen carved from obsidian, her gaze distant and unyielding. This is a mistake, T's father, Gregory Lee, croaked, stepping forward with a trembling hand outstretched. Daniel, Joon, we are family. You wouldn't destroy your own blood for a woman. Joon's expression didn't shift, but the air around him seemed to sharpen. He stepped closer to Mara, his shoulder brushing hers in a silent display of absolute unity. You lost the right to call me family the moment you treated marriage like a liquidation sale, and you made the mistake of thinking Mara was just a woman. She is the Kim syndicate's most valuable asset. She is my wife, and as of tonight, she is your superior. Joon turned to Mara, his voice dropping to that low, intimate rumble that belonged only to her. The cars are waiting, my love. We have an empire to run, and I believe we've spent enough time in the company of ghosts. Mara took one last look at Lee Tae. He looked utterly diminished, a man who had sold his soul for a fortune only to realize the currency was now worthless. She didn't feel the surge of petty spite she had expected. Instead, she felt a profound, liberating indifference. She had outgrown this room, these people, and the small, narrow life they had tried to trap her in. Goodbye, T, she said softly, though the words carried the weight of a final sentence. I'd tell you to keep the ring, but I believe it's currently being appraised as part of your bankruptcy filings. She turned, her white satin train sweeping across the marble floor like a cresting wave. As she walked toward the exit, the security detail, Joon's men, fell into formation behind them, a phalanx of shadows protecting the new masters of the city. Outside, the cool night air greeted them, smelling of rain and limitless possibility. Joon handed her into the back of the sleek, black limousine, his hand lingering on hers as he settled into the seat beside her. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, a sprawling grid of power that now answered to them. Mara leaned her head back against the leather, her hand resting over Joon's. The betrayal that had once shattered her world was now nothing more than the foundation for the fortress they had built together. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a matriarch, and her reign had only just begun.